Alright, so we're going to discuss the, excuse me, Great War, everything that we've kind of been studying about the Western world is kind of leading up to this. It's called the Great War, or the War to End All Wars. It should be pointed out real quick that everybody was really excited for this. Europe had not seen a war on its continent basically since Napoleon, but if you can kind of take out the Franco-Prussian War because that was quick. Even though it was bloody and deadly, it was quick. So, people in Britain, people in Germany, people in Spain, Italy, a lot of these places, Russia, they were getting excited. And was the war inevitable? That's a question that people still ask today, but there's a lot of things that happened that the war could have been avoided quite easily, but it was not. So this is what we're going to kind of discuss in this PowerPoint. And this is just a quick reminder of the crises that were going on. We've already talked about them, so I'm not going to go through them again, but here's kind of a map of how Africa was partitioned and how seemingly all of these European countries are fighting for Africa. And when you have war, and when you think that you're going to go to war, you start building up technology, and you start building up munitions, and you start having research and development and creating new ways to win wars. As like we've talked about, that's what human beings are good at. They're good at killing other human beings and making things to do it efficiently. So here's just a quick look at the alliance system that had formed by the time the Balkans kind of erupted, and we'll talk about that on the next slide. But I just wanted to show you where for those of you who don't know where the Balkans are, it's kind of southeast Europe. That would be Bulgaria, Romania, Serbia, Greece, areas like that. Those are the Balkans, and they were under Ottoman control, most of them, but some of them were under the kind of neutral Russian control, and the Balkans kind of do reach into the Austro-Hungarian Empire a little bit as well. So when things get messy there, it tends to affect all of Europe. So this is just a map, an example of the alliances that were the countries that were connected right before World War I. The interesting thing is Europe seemed peaceful, even though they're fighting in Africa. On the outside, Europe seemed peaceful right up to the war. These two systems of alliances, the Triple Entente, which is Russia, France, and Britain, and the Triple Alliance, and that's Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy. Even though they were scrambling for colonies, which led to armament, on the outside, nobody really knew that war was coming. Politicians did, military men did, military women did, but for the most part, before the Balkans crisis and before the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, things seemingly were peaceful. So the crisis kind of started, the wheels to World War II, World War I, kind of started in 1912 in the Balkans. There were a series of kind of short wars that kind of dragged everybody, shouldn't say dragged, that everybody was paying attention to. This is nothing new. In 1912, Italy and Turkey fought each other over Africa. Turkey lost and was forced to hand over Libya, Rhodes, and some islands to the Italians. This is really the degeneration of the Ottoman Empire. By this time, everybody knows the Ottoman Empire it's called the sick man of Europe. The problem is there's so many different nationalities and religions that live in the Ottoman Empire. Europeans, leaders knew that when it crumbled, nationalism, religious strife, ethnic cleansing, things like that were bound to happen, which is basically what ends up happening at the end of the Cold War in the 1990s. So Italy beats what we would consider Turkey today. They were still the Ottoman Empire, but a very, very weak empire. Later in 1912, there's the First Balkan War, which Ottoman Empire's troubles weren't over yet. Um, they concluded peace with Italy, and then they found themselves in a war with four small nations over possessions of Balkan territories. Right. So now all of these nations are saying, "Hey, we're going to fight the Ottoman Empire." Greece, Serbia, Bulgaria, and Montenegro all kind of started fighting the Ottoman Empire to gain their own independent nations. European powers intervened here, and it ended in 1913. But Turkey lost out again, and they lost the island of Crete and most of its European possessions. Okay, so even though the Ottoman Empire lost, Europe steps in and says, "Hey, we need to keep the peace," right? So you can already see that maybe Europeans don't want to go to war necessarily, especially over land. The Second Balkan War happens in 1913, and this happens when Bulgaria, which was unsatisfied with the spoils it got, it's a long story, but they didn't think that they got enough because they beat the Ottoman Empire. They fought with everybody. They fought against everybody they fought with the first time around, including Greece and Serbia and Montenegro, and they started fighting them for part of Macedonia. So between May and July of 1913, Bulgaria gets pushed back, Romania is captured, and the Bulgarian capital of Sofia is captured in August by the Greeks, the Serbs, and the Montenegrins. They surrendered in August, and they had to give everything back to the Ottoman Empire that they won earlier. Right? So their capital, they lost Adrianople as well, which is close to Istanbul. And so after 1913, there was kind of this troubled peace. See, but the problem is after all of these kind of little skirmishes / wars occurred, nobody was really happy with what they had. Because everybody wanted, the Balkans are a tinderbox. There's a lot of people living there, there's not that much land, and there's a lot of different religions, so everybody thinks they have grounds, and they all can argue it, grounds for more land, and a lot of the best land. And then there's also the Muslim, Catholic, Orthodox trifecta in there as well, right? A lot of times it's Orthodox Christians fighting Catholic Christians, or Muslims fighting Catholics with the Orthodox on the Muslim side, or vice versa. So there's all of this hodgepodge of nationalities and religions, and nobody was happy in the Balkans in 1913 about the religion, about being under the Ottoman Empire, and about how much land they had, especially Serbia and Greece, because they kept being on the winning side of wars. But the Europeans keep stepping in and saying, no, just be happy with what you have. We'll try to figure it out. Okay, so the Serbs and the Greeks are very mad. And this is important because it will be a Serbian national who actually ends up assassinating the Archduke, which kind of begins the road to World War I. So, on June 28, 1914, Bosnian Serbs assassinated the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. And the Archduke Franz Ferdinand is the second in line to the monarchy of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Okay? So he's like, I don't know, Prince William, I don't know who's second in line to the British crown. Whoever's second in line to the British crown. Serbian nationalists assassinated him. It was kind of this secret, not kind of, it was a secret society, underground organization, and they called themselves the Black Hand. And what they were looking for was independence and expansion. So this was not the Serbian government, this was not, any type of political faction. This was an underground, illegal secret society who ended up killing the Archduke, which ends up starting World War I. The guy who killed him, his name is Gavrilo Princip. I don't know if any of you have heard of him or not. But on June 28, 1914, the assassination occurs. So the interesting thing about this whole assassination is, real quick story, is the Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife had already passed 3 or 4 guys who were supposed to assassinate him, right? So they set up people along the line, and if you didn't get a chance, because they were using pistols that weren't very accurate, so if you didn't get a chance to fire, or if you lost your nerve, walking up to the Archduke's car and shooting him in the head, which basically is what you had to do back then, to make sure you got it right. There are no sniper rifles back then, especially for this underground society. And so what happens is I think Princip was the 4th or the 5th guy who was supposed to in line to assassinate him. And what happens is Princip loses his nerve, and he actually goes into a cafe to get a cup of coffee and some bread, and he just is going to let the Archduke pass, right? But what ends up happening is the Archduke's car takes a turn, and it ends up going down the alley, and it's the wrong way. It's off of the route, and they actually get stuck. And they get stuck right in front of where Gavrilo Princip is drinking coffee and eating bread and eating his sandwich. Unbelievable. So the car starts to back up because it gets into a blind alley and it can't move anymore. Starts to back up. Gavrilo Princip is sitting there with his gun, shoots the Archduke and his wife, Sophia, and kills them both, I believe. Right? Interesting story. The other interesting part about this is he's in Serbia, and the Serbian government said they wanted him to be in a car, not a convertible, but a car with windows, because they were afraid that something like this was going to happen. And the Archduke told him no. He said no, because the Serb people love me. They're not gonna do anything to me. Well, it was the Serb people who ended up assassinating him, right? So that's what happened. So the second in line to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire is assassinated by a secret society, Serbian nationalist in Sarajevo. Sorry, I forgot to mention this is in Sarajevo. So what quickly happens is the Austro-Hungarian Empire sends an ultimatum to the Serbian government, and they make 10 demands, and the Serbian government says yes to all of them, including demanding prosecution on their own, no public condemnation, arrest all the Black Hand, this and that, and they make 10 demands, and there were a few little ones that the Serbians didn't want. The main one was they didn't want the Austrian-Hungarian policemen and government doing the investigation. They wanted to do it themselves. They basically said yes to every demand that Austria-Hungary said, except we don't want your police doing it. We want ours. Okay. These demands were supposed to be denounced so the Austro-Hungarian Empire could go in there and crush Serbia and make it part of its own empire. But they weren't denounced. Only one was. But it still didn't matter, because then Serbia mobilized, and then this is the kind of the July crisis mode. In July, everybody starts saying, well, now these alliances that we have may bring us into war. And after Austria-Hungary says, no, we want all 10 demands renounced or we're going to war, after they say that, then the Russians announce partial mobilization to defend Serbia, right? Because we've talked about the Serbs are Slavic people, they're Orthodox Christians, and the Russian Orthodox Church is kind of the leader of the Orthodox Church in the world, right? They're supposed to say, wherever Orthodox Christians are being persecuted, we will come help them. And they're also Slavic people, so Russia partially mobilizes. Germany goes to France and asks them, if they're going to intend to keep their treaty with the Russians. France tells Germany it will act in its own. France, and these are all kind of secret meetings. This is kind of where the secrecy comes in. We'll talk about what happens after World War I. These are all kind of secret meetings. So Germany says, all right, France, we know you're allied with Russia. If we go to war with Russia, are you going to go to war? And France's answer is, we will act in our own interests, which basically means, yes, we will, right? And Germany's worried because they don't want to fight a two-front war, right? They have Russia on their east side and France on their west side, so they don't want to fight a two-front war. So France says, yes, we will fight you. Knowing that Germany was going to have to fight on two fronts, the Germans mobilize on August 1st, right? All through July. They're trying to do this diplomatically, but diplomacy did not work. 2 days later, the Germans invade Belgium to take Paris. Now, as what will happen with World War II, Belgium is a neutral country. So when the Germans went through Belgium to take France, that was illegal. So that gave Britain the reason to go to war against the Germans. Right? Japan wants German colonies, so they fight against Germany. They're on the side of the British and the French and the Russians because they want to take Germany's kind of got a lot of colonies in East Asia, and Japan wants those. So they enter the war on the side of Russia, Britain, and France. Okay, so that's what occurs. All of this is happening, and a lot of people in Britain, a lot of people in the government are kind of trying to see if people don't want to fight. But at the same time, like I talked about, there's this real buzz that's going around Europe at the time. People are really, without using it, too much, they're excited for war. A lot of these people, especially young men, 18 to 20, they have no idea what war is like. They've never seen it, and they want to be a part of it. And so this whole month after the assassination is kind of called the tragedy of miscalculations. From 5 weeks from the assassination, war was declared. So they had 5 weeks to stop it, and nobody really does. Right? This is because Austria was determined to fight Serbia. Germany was unwilling to restrain Austria, and Russia was using the Serbs as an excuse to get into the Balkans. Right? This is all geopolitics. This is all realpolitik, as Bismarck would say. They all wanted to show force rather than be diplomatic. Germany also felt that it was time to move on Russia because Russia had lost a war in 1905 against Japan, and they were still on the downside. So the Germans said, hey, we can take care of one of our main antagonists right now. And this kind of becomes a sense of urgency, and it kind of gets this lure of bold, like the Germans are thinking, if we can just strike quick and move quick, we can not only dominate France, but we can also dominate Russia, right? We can fight a two-front war, we just have to do it very quickly. And that's what the Schlieffen Plan is. It's called the Schlieffen Plan because it was made up by a German general called Schlieffen. And his whole plan, which a lot of people say would have worked if the German military just wasn't afraid to go all in. What ends up happening is the German military is afraid to go all in the plan, and they kind of end up getting stalled. But a lot of military historians say if they just would have done what Schlieffen wanted to in September of 1914, because nobody's mobilized. The Germans were by far the most mobilized society at the time. They were almost ready for war, right? From July to September is not very long to mobilize for war, especially back then, but they did it. And his plan was to attack France first and quickly, and then turn and head east, take over Paris, take over the capital, and then head east to the more slower, less industrialized nation of Russia, and do that. and it almost worked. They almost got to Paris. They got to the outskirts of Paris, and once they were going to take Paris, then they were going to turn around and head to Russia, and it almost worked, but they just didn't go all in, and so they get to the outskirts of Paris, and then the Triple Entente holds them down on the River Marne, and this is where the trench warfare begins. And we'll talk about trench warfare. This is the most important strategic battle of the war, because this is what really sets World War I into trench warfare. It's this idea that we're hunkering down and we're going to fight for inches. They literally fight for inches and feet while men are dying all around them. And this whole Battle of Marne had this mix of fanfare, but at the same time there was a lot of private concern. Nationalists, right? German nationalists, French nationalists, British nationalists, they're all hoping for a quick, glorious win, right? While others are saying, this probably isn't that great idea, but many young men conscript because both sides thought that there's this old adage, they thought the war would be over by Christmas, right? Everybody was really looking for this quick strike. We're going to bring glory to our nation, and then our enemies are going to go down, and then we'll be home by Christmas, and then that'll be that. But what ends up happening is, for the next 4 years, the battle line that started at the Marne River moves very little. Alright, so from what you guys watched, that World War I in color, which I think is really cool. Anything back then that they can put color to is awesome. You kind of got an idea of what trench warfare was like. They actually ended up being called the lousy scratch holes because lice was everywhere. I mean, men had lice. They just couldn't get rid of the rats. It was wet. It was cold. It was hot. It was just a miserable existence of just kind of daily routines and continuous killing. Continuous, right? On the Western Front, there was some 25,000 miles of trenches dug during the war. There were mazes. There was lines, telegraph lines, complex ammo dumps, telephones, water, hospitals, command posts. And the interesting thing about these trenches is everybody thought this war was going to be based on movement, right, when it first happened. But when the Germans get hunkered down in the Marne, things slowed to a snail's pace. Like I said, it was wet, it was cold, there was mud, rats eating dead soldiers, lice. There's some places that soldiers wrote where, like, you just didn't have the time or the energy or the place to bury people. People would be unburied for months, just laying there in these trenches. It was a horrible existence, and this is really what makes a lot of people not too big on war afterwards. They say on average about 7,000 between 1916 and 1917, about 7,000 British soldiers were killed or wounded every day. Alright, I mean, when you think about this, the Iraq War is awful, right? And we don't want any of our troops dying, but I think there's been 5,000 deaths. I mean, numerous, hundreds of thousands of casualties, in the sense that casualties are counted not just people who were killed, but also wounded mentally and physically. And just think 7,000 British soldiers were killed or wounded every day. That's an astronomical number. And the reason for the high death tolls were the new weapons. Besides machine guns, right, which these people in the trenches never really got used to. There was artillery, exploding bullets, liquid fire. You see those guys with fire on their backs. What they would do is they would try to get to the opposite trench and then just start unloading with fire. Mustard gas and subs. Mustard gas, I'm sure all of you have heard of it at some point. You can see these guys wearing masks on the bottom right. It was a German invention, but don't think that it was just the Germans who used mustard gas. There's a lot of evidence that the British also used it. And it's called mustard gas because it is actually yellow. So what it was is it started with chlorine gas. I mean, I don't know exactly what was in mustard gas, but it's a blistering agent, which means it destroys DNA, so it kills tissue. And it was really, really hard to tell, except by smell, right? So when you got gassed, you weren't sure what kind of gas it was, or if it was cloudy, or if it was foggy. It was really hard to tell what was going on a lot of times, if it was dark, or if it was dusk, dawn, except by the smell. But then you get used to it. So even though it hangs around, and they didn't know this, it hangs around for something like 14 days or something like that. But then when you get used to the smell, you have no idea that you're still breathing it in. Okay? I mean, at first the gas masks were useless to it, and it just stuck around. So usually about 3 to 4 days into a gassing, people started dying. That's when we kind of figured out that things weren't right. And this was kind of the first usage of chemical warfare in history. In fact, the Iraqis are going to use this against the Iranians in the Iraq-Iran War in 1980. Saddam Hussein was big in chemical warfare, and obviously today we also have other people who are doing it with the Syrians. Nobody's sure which side is doing it, but this is kind of the beginning of this chemical warfare, and it worked, and it was not pretty. So you get all these new weapons, and you also get this idea that none of the generals and the leadership of any of these countries really wanted to change what they were doing. So it was very much I'm with artillery one side, and then when you stop the artillery barrage, then your soldiers would come out of the trenches, and then they would charge, right? And that's what was called no man's land, in between the trenches, right? There's barbed wire, there's dead bodies, there's holes from constant artillery. And so the other side knew when you were going to charge. Once the artillery stopped, then they knew that you were going to charge, so they just wait for the artillery to stop, and then the enemy, the other side, would charge, and then you just get mowed down by machine guns, by artillery, by everything else, and then it just was reversed. And then the other side would do the same thing, and they'd bomb. So it was just like this over and over and over, and nobody learned from their mistakes. And that's why the trench warfare was so devastating. That's why World War I was so devastating, is because nobody learned from their mistakes. And you also have this new weaponry, chemicals, bullets, machine guns, things of that nature. You also have railroads, and we talked about that with the Korean War. It makes transport easier. It's more mobile. You can take men to the front. The problem with the railroads is that machine guns have a tremendous advantage over slow-moving machines. So even though you do have an easier way to move men besides horses and walking at the same time, machine guns, you can just shoot it into a train. So that kind of offsetted that. But in the end, it actually helped. And we also talk about subs. In May 1915, the Lusitania was sunk by a German sub. The Germans were light years ahead in the submarine area. And in May 7th, 1915, it was sunk. The Lusitania was sunk. And if any of you have heard of the Lusitania, basically what it was is, at this time the Americans were neutral, but they kept sending over goods and money and war material to the Entente, to the French, especially to the British. They were loaning it. I mean, the British and the French were having to pay for it with interest, but the Americans, who were supposed to be neutral, kept doing that. And what they would do is they would put all of this material or this money or whatever the Entente asked for in ships that were supposed to be only carrying humans, right, or passenger ships, so to speak. So they didn't think that the Germans would take out these ships with the submarines, because the submarine warfare was very effective for the Germans in cutting off a lot of the supplies to the Triple Entente. But what ends up happening on May 7th, 1915, is the Germans actually sink the Lusitania, and the Americans claimed that it was just a passenger ship, and it looked like that at the beginning, but in all actuality, it was a ship that was carrying a lot of material illegally from the United States to the Triple Entente. So, there's one way to look at it. It's war. Germany didn't want to do that anymore, so they sunk it. But at the same time, there was a lot of passenger ships. Also, on the same time, is the fact that the British, or the Americans, did it on purpose. So even after that, America does not declare war. They don't come into the war until 1917. But this is kind of when you get this idea of America is going to come into the war. And by the way, America made a huge amount of money off of World War I, the U.S. government. They were basically gun runners in a way. So this is really, after World War I, is really when the economic center of the world moves from London to New York City after World War I, because not only are they victorious, but everybody in Europe owes them money, right? Because they've learned, since they stayed neutrals for long enough, that making materials and things of that nature, they were owed a lot of money, and the Triple Entente paid them back. Real quickly though, let's talk about a few of the real quick war battles that were going on at the time. Two major ones were Verdun and the Somme. February 16th, the Battle of Verdun had little strategic importance, but it was kind of a symbol of strength. The Germans really wanted, by 1916, this is 2 years into the war, to have the French throw everything out at them, and they just wanted to beat the French. And just try to end the war. The Germans threw over artillery 1 million shells on the first day alone, with no gain. During this battle, 7,000 Germans were actually dying a day. This does not count the wounded into these casualties, right? This is a massive amount of artillery and weaponry and bullets and mustard gas and everything flying around, and men were dying at an enormous rate for a long time. And this is in February. It's cold, it's wet, right? It's a miserable existence. By the end of June, 400,000 people were dead, right? With very little movement whatsoever of the trenches. So it was of zero strategic importance. All it did was kill more men. After the Battle of Verdun ended, the Battle of the Somme continued. Kind of how they left off. This was an Allied attack. People say that you could actually, even though it's in France, you could actually hear the attack in England. When the Allies attacked, 20,000 British soldiers died in the first day. 40,000 were wounded, okay, in the first day alone. And this fought until mid-November, from June to mid-November. The totals are, it's hard to come by, but they probably think about 500,000 Germans died, 400,000 British died, and 200,000 French people died in French military in this Battle of the Somme alone. But surprisingly, even at the end of 1916 into 1917, people were still willing to fight, and desertions were almost nil, right? And just these wars keep going into 1917. Okay. And then we're going to talk about the home front, but even into 1917, with all of this stuff going on, people are still thinking that there's going to be an end soon, and that they want to win. Right? This is a war that people want to win. They do not want to stalemate, so they just keep throwing these kids in over and over and over again to get slaughtered, hoping that something will happen, but it really does not. So here's a picture of the trenches. You can see, I mean, it's very sophisticated, and it doesn't look terrible from here, but it was a miserable existence, right? Rows and rows. So World War I is the first war that is actually called Total War, and they call it a total war because not only was it men and women in the military fighting, but it was also the home front. Everybody was involved in the war. It wasn't just the military. Okay, and the cost of war in money and manpower was staggering. Like, for instance, in 1914, Germany was spending about 36 million marks a day on the war. By 1918, they were spending 146 million marks a day. Britain thought it would need about 100,000 men. Ended up calling up 3 million. And feeding and clothing and equipping these people was very hard. So women kind of become the face of the war front at home, so to speak. They became recruited in a field that were excluded from them, from unskilled job into skilled jobs. They became the symbol. By the end of the war, a third of heavy industry in Britain were employed by women. Right, heavy industry. We're talking about building, cars, building machines, things that the army needed to keep, the military needed to keep going. Women were highly skilled, and they were involved in a lot of this. Nearly 1 million women actually worked in Britain at the time, which was a staggering number. I'm not exactly sure how many worked before that, but it wasn't even close to that. In France, they had over 700,000 women working in heavy industry, right? So this is a total effort, and women are stepping into jobs that nobody thought that they should do before, and they're doing them. Right. They were also on the lines as well, right? They were nurses, they were ambulance. Back at home, they learned to drive. They could ride the train, they could walk on the street alone, etc. Things that, you gotta remember, this is 1914, England and Europe, really, not just England. These are things that women were not allowed to do before. They could use words like pregnancy or prostitution, right, out loud. They could, instead of a certain condition, so to speak, they could smoke, cut their hair. They weren't wearing dresses anymore. The birth rates are plummeting. Not only are birth rates plummeting because there's no men around, but even if there are men around, women are getting the choice, right, of whether to procreate or not. The problem was, and this happens in America as well, is that once the war is over, they had to go back home. But many needed money because they were widows, and they didn't want to go back to their low-paying textiles, garments, or domestic service, right? Once they got into it, and they realized that they could do it, and they enjoyed doing it, and they were making money, they didn't want to go back, right? So at the end of the war, governments start giving them things to go back home and get pregnant and leave the workforce. Literally, that's what the British government, and the French government tried to do, right? We have all of these guys who fought in the war. They need to come back and have jobs. Thanks for all your help, but we need to go back to traditional roles, right? But like I said, a lot of these women didn't have their husbands, they had 3 kids, their husbands went to war, and now they have no way of supporting themselves enough for 3 kids. This is a big deal during World War II as well. And it's not just Britain. This is kind of a generalization of throughout Europe. Also, in 1918, right as the war ends, women get suffrage. They get the right to vote in Britain because of this. In 1919, they get it in the United States. So women were very, very important to the fight at home. And there's also this idea, which is very hard, and this goes along with World War II as well, is Europe is getting devastated, and a lot of the places that agriculture that feeds Europe are being fought, right? These plains that are easy to fight, easy to control, the trenches, so there wasn't a lot of food and there weren't a lot of things. So then the government had to start making decisions as to, well, who's more important, right? There's not a lot of wool, there's not a lot of cotton, there's not a lot of things coming in. Do we feed and clothe our population, or does most of that food and clothing go to the men who are fighting the home front? And these are daily decisions that the governments had to make, right? And I don't, you can't really say which one is better than the other. You just, you don't know. So in most cases, they kind of split it up, which kind of ended up meaning that both sides did not benefit from it. But think about that for a while. This is really a World War II thing. America has never really had that problem since they've never had a war on their turf, so to speak, right? But the European governments really had to come up with ideas to feed not only their population and clothe their population, but the guys who were fighting as well. And that's kind of part of the strains of war. It was economic. I mean, all of these countries are borrowing or printing money, and well over half of their GDPs are going to the actual war. Germany was completely blockaded, so they had to increase their money by 1,000%, right? So that means inflation. Prices rise through the roof, right? And a lot of people are pushed into poverty who aren't fighting. And this starts to take its toll, right? We talked about 1916, 1917. Nobody's really mutinying. By the middle to end of 1917, 2/3 of the French army had mutinied, and they were having these problems with soldiers self-mutilating themselves to get off the front, because they had lack of clothing, lack of food, discontent, economics controls, there's black markets, there's a lot of hostility towards, they're seeing all of their buddies die, and really they're not even moving the trenches, right? So 2/3 of the French army mutinied. They actually put it down, and they shot 23 people, and 250 of them were marched, and 250 more were marched into no man's land and dropped off, right? They're saying, we're not going to shoot you, but we're going to put you in the middle of where all this fighting is. Good luck. And all of those men died as well. So there's that idea too. That's a very long story short. The French came back from it, but there's just discontent everywhere. Okay. I think that's in Downton Abbey, isn't it? Doesn't I think it's Thomas. He self-mutilates himself. He cuts his hand or shoots his hand so he can get off the front, because the front was not a good place to be. All right. And so this is kind of what this total war means. It's the population getting involved, not just the people who fight in the military. It's propaganda. I'll show you a few propaganda pictures on the next. It's this idea that this total war is the idea that people are as important as soldiers, right? Workers, taxpayers, consumers, all of these civilians are important because they produce munitions, they buy war bonds, they pay higher taxes, they go through inflation, they go through rationing, and they're also living in these areas, especially Britain, France, Germany, Russia, these people who are really in the war now. The government completely takes control of production and distribution, right? Because they have to ration out who goes where. And at the same time, people are dying, right? In the end, here's just this total war. 74 million men were mobilized, and by the end of it, 16,000 soldiers died each day on both sides total. And you get violence and you get refugees on a scale that really had never been seen before. So this is just a mind-blowing idea to people. I think they said well over 50% of the French men aged 18 to 23, they lost. Right? Birth rates are going down because there's not enough men for women. I mean, men are dying on a massive scale. And they didn't know what to do about it. So this is kind of this total war idea, is that it affected everybody, but at the same time, everybody was working for it, especially women. They're very important. So this is propaganda, pretty easy to see, right? Women of Britain say go, go, right? They're all their loved ones are leaving, but they're saying do it for us. It's up to you to protect the nation's honor, enlist now. That's an American propaganda. There was a lot of propaganda about the Huns, who are Germans, right? They called Germans the Huns, keep the Huns out of Europe, that kind of idea. It showed them in their scary hats and everything. This Russian sign says all for war, meaning everybody needs to work, and here's a woman. This is a war bond, it says here. Buy for 5.5 rubles, probably. War bond. We need everybody to fight for us. And essentially what a war bond is the government would issue them, you would buy them, and then the government would say, all right, we're going to pay you back with interest, and then they would fund their war machine through that type of money. And so that's what a war bond is. Alright, so we'll talk about the Russian revolutions real quickly. This was the first country to really break from the strain of war. Like everybody else, they thought the war would be over quickly, and Tsar Nicholas II wanted more patriotism, right? A lot of these people he had the feeling that if we went to war and we won, people would be proud to be Russian, because like I said, in 1905 they lost a war to Japan, right? Russia loses to Japan. That was an embarrassment. So Nicholas II personally commanded his troops, and he didn't do it very well. So he's at the front, while things at home are getting off cue. Actually, Rasputin is actually a real person, and he really was this weird, self-flagellating monk who apparently the women really did like, and he was kind of running things at home, and he really had Nicholas II's wife under his control. So he's kind of running things at home while Nicholas, this is a long story short, while Nicholas, and if you're interested in doing Rasputin or any of this on your PowerPoint presentation, then I'd be more than happy to write you. This is an interesting topic. But not only that, so Nicholas II is at the front, leading his troops not very well, like we talked about. And at home, there's labor movements that are increasing. Soldiers are actually walking away to go home. They're actually just leaving the front and saying, I'm not going to fight anymore. You can shoot me if you want, but I'm going home. And there was also urban uprisings at the same time. And all of this comes together on National Women's Day. And these women are demanding food, and not just women, but in kind of a procession, a parade, so to speak. These people march in St. Petersburg, and they demand food, fuel, and political reform, right? Nick II, while on the home front, sends police in. The police mutiny. This is like Paris all over again, kind of. The police mutiny, 60,000 of them, and by March, he actually abdicates. It was very non-violent. The Petersburg riots were about to be violent, but then he sends the police in, and the police say, no, we're not going to shoot on our own people, especially since there's a lot of women and there's a lot going on here. We're not going to do it. So very quietly, Nicholas II abdicates and says, I am no longer the Tsar. So what ends up happening is a provisional government comes in. This is still in February, early March. A provisional government is created, and I don't know if you've heard of him, but it's led by Lev Kamensky. They're mainly middle-class people. This is kind of like a bourgeois type of government. They're real liberal. They're into democracy. They're into constitutions. And you have to understand, this is Russia. They've never had one before, right? They've been under a monarch or a czar since the 1500s, and before that, it was just a whole bunch of little states put together, right? So that, democracy is not going to happen overnight here. They were very democratic, very liberal, but they made Kamensky and the provisional government made two very big mistakes. The first one was staying in the war. Most people in Russia by February 1917 did not want to fight the war anymore, but the government insisted because they did not want to lose, and they thought that, well, if we're the government who ends the war, everybody's going to mutiny against us, which actually is not that true. And the second thing they did, since they were democratic and they were liberal, they let out all of the political prisoners that the Tsar's secret police, the Okhrana, had put in prison. And most of these political prisoners were actually communists. So now Russia had a whole bunch of communists running around, and either they were political prisoners or they were exiled. So when the Tsar abdicates, all of these people from around Europe, like Lenin, Trotsky, guys who had been exiled, come back to Russia and start creating this communist party called the Bolsheviks, which means majority. Bolshe in Russian is big, large. Bolsheviks means majority. The interesting thing is they had little to do with the February Revolution. They kind of were surprised themselves to even gain power. So what happens is this provisional government is still running things, but the Bolsheviks start creating popular... These guys were supreme politicians. They start creating their own political party, and they start going to cities and saying, we're going to create this revolution. They have this motto, peace, land, and bread. We're going to end the war. We're going to spread out the land and give everybody equal land, and everybody's going to get bread, right? Nobody's going to be starving anymore because we're going to end the war. And they gain power in this, and people listen to them. The interesting thing about the Bolsheviks is they believed in the factory workers, and they wanted a proletariat revolution of workers, but Russia was 85% peasant. So that's kind of the interesting thing about Russia, is they wanted this revolution of workers, but there were very few workers that were involved. But at the time, nobody really understood what a communist revolution was. They just hear this peace, land, and bread idea, right? Which sounds good at the time. So Lenin comes in. He's exiled from 1900 to 1917, and they're also very successful because they're tight and they're a conspiratorial organization. That they were very tactical, in the sense that they believe, they're a very not really a meritocracy, but they very much believed in, we have 3 or 4 really smart guys, and they're going to run the government, and then everybody else is going to listen to what these guys have to say. Right? They're really tight-knit, and they believe in leading from the top down, right? Once we get voted in, these people are going to listen to what we say because we're smarter than them. That was kind of their idea. So they go around constantly saying we need to end this war, and people agree with them. So in October, they get Trotsky, who's kind of the face. Leon Trotsky was kind of the good-looking, eloquent. He's the guy that got a lot of people on the Bolshevik side. It wasn't Lenin. Lenin was kind of the zealot. He was very violent as well. But Trotsky was more of the mind, and he was good-looking, and he was eloquent, and he's charismatic. So he was kind of the face of the Bolsheviks, which is too bad for him because he ends up with an ice pick in his head in Mexico, right? From Joseph Stalin. But at the time, he's goaded, and he was also a very good military man. He ends up kind of leading the Red Army, which is no small task in itself. So Trotsky was kind of this do-it-all guy. Leon Trotsky, he's also an interesting man if you want to look him up. Lenin convinces him to take over the provisional government, and so he uses what they would call the Red Army, and he takes over the Winter Palace, which is where the provisional government was staying, and there was little to no resistance. It wasn't violent. They just kind of walked into the Winter Palace and said, hey, we're taking over, and the provisional government said, okay. And life kind of went on as normal. So that's kind of one misconception, is that this Russian Revolution was very violent. It was very violent afterwards, but the actual overthrowing of the government by the Bolsheviks was completely non-violent. They just marched in, took it over, and the provisional government said okay, and the Bolsheviks said okay, we run Russia now. Their first move was to go against anybody who was politically opposed to them, meaning people who still thought the Tsar should be in power, people who we didn't really mention them, but the Mensheviks, these other communists who had different ideals from them. So Lenin and Trotsky, they're very precise. They know what they're doing. So once they got political control, they moved against anybody who opposed them. They allowed an election. They actually lost the election, so they overthrow the election and just say, well, since you got, and then they turn into a one-party dictatorship, is what ends up happening. Even though they are popular, they weren't popular enough to win a general election because you had so many people who were against them. There's a lot of people who are still very much loyal to the Tsar and the family. But they say, well, we didn't win the election, that's okay. We're still the leaders here. It becomes a one-party dictatorship. The second move they do is they do reform land. They take all of landowners' land and they give it to peasants without compensation, right? Meaning they take land from a lot of people who had land, who were powerful under the Tsar, take all their land, don't give them any money for it, and basically either kill them or kick them out of the country, and then give the land to the peasants, right? So that's the land part of the peace, land, and bread. They nationalized banks, and they also gave workers control of the factories. And once they, and the other interesting thing is once soldiers hear that the Tsar was overthrown, or abdicated, and then the provisional government was overthrown, the Russian army just crumbles, right? People start running home. It doesn't matter. Even though the Bolsheviks said they were going to end the war, the Russian army was in shambles as it was. But their last move was to sign the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, which was a treaty with Germany, and they made peace and they got out of the war. Right. So that's, and that actually makes a lot of people upset when the Russian nation leads the war. But the Bolsheviks said we're going to end the war, and they do end the war. But this isn't by no means a treaty, an alliance. Lenin signed the treaty because he believed in world revolution, and he believed the world revolution was inevitable. So he's like, yeah, we'll sign this peace treaty with Germany now, but we don't really care because at some point it's going to be inevitable that we take them over anyways. This is just kind of a way for us to get all our troops back, create our own army, get everything we need to get done at home, and then after we get everything we need to get done at home, then the revolution is just going to spread, and it's going to spread through the world. So this whole idea of being embarrassed because they signed a treaty to get out of the war, Lenin and the Bolsheviks didn't care, and most people in Russia didn't care. They wanted to end the war anyways. So that's kind of how they gained power. I don't know how much we'll talk about the Civil War, which was devastating, the Russian Civil War, but we'll try to get into it a little bit. So that's kind of the Russian Revolution. And then once Russia leaves the war, a lot of people thought that Germany was going to win at that time, but what ends up happening is America gets involved and the Germans kind of run out of military zeal. We'll talk a little bit about that next. All right, so you can see the New World Order here. This is post World War I, where Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, Yugoslavia, Albania, all of those are the Balkans right there. Greece, that used to be part of the Ottoman Empire, right? So all of these new places were made out of nothing. Okay. You got a new Poland here that's taken mostly from what used to be Germany. There's a little bit of Russia involved in that as well, but you have a new Poland, Slovakia, which is basically Czechoslovakia. This wasn't a great map, but you can see Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Iran, Palestine. All of these places are newly created areas. That's all out of the Ottoman Empire also. So they carve up the Ottoman Empire, and they give it to people, right? They try to, and in their defense, they try to create stuff that's fair, right? They try to get as many people who would be considered Syrian in Syria. They try to get as many people who would think of themselves, if you made a country and called it Iraq, who would think of themselves as Iraqis, and so on and so forth. It's not like they just did it arbitrarily, even though all of these borders, that's exactly what they are. They're just arbitrary lines. But they tried to do it as best they could, right? Because this whole idea of nationalism, everybody in the West thinks that everybody wanted to live in a nation. And when you carve them up and you create nations, then you can control them, and that's kind of what the West did. So in a sense, they were winners. That France and Britain kind of carved up the Middle East and East Asia for themselves, but at the same time, there's this large disillusionment, and all of these things are going to come back to haunt them. I mean, hindsight's 2020. It's easy to blame them now, but there was no real definitive answer for anything that came out of World War I besides Germany lost, right? And so that's, next week we'll talk about what happens in between, and this is one very large reason why Hitler becomes as popular as he does, because Germans are pissed off. They feel like they got a raw deal.